You're listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast. We're an independent, general interest bookstore putting great reads in the hands of people in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. Hosted by resident Skylighters, we're here to bring you new and exciting author conversations, group reads, and bookseller chats. Happy listening. Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome back to the SKYLIT Books podcast. I'm your host, Natalie, and today we are so excited to welcome Elizabeth Kilcoyne to talk about her debut YA novel, Wake the Bones. Elizabeth Kilcoyne is an author, poet, and playwright from Lexington, Kentucky, who began this story after stacking rocks in her family cemetery one day when she realized she was standing on her own grave. She has been published in several literary journals, including Still, the Journal, and Wake the Bones is her first novel. Thanks so much for being here, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So before I have you read a little something for us, would you like to give us, I'd love to hear a little about how this story came about, especially from how it started sitting in your family cemetery and a little bit of the origin, and then you can maybe read a little bit and introduce us to Laurel and her world.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was writing Wake the Bones, I called it sort of the big grief book. I was processing a lot of death that had gone on, not just in my own family, but in my friend group and the community around me fairly quickly, and trying to come to terms with how you keep going when something like that happens. But I had always wanted to write a story set in my hometown of Kentucky, my home state of Kentucky. And I had always wanted to sort of explore the living and dying, not just of people, but like of towns in rural Kentucky as times change, as particularly in single commodity economies, when there's no more demand for that commodity, entire towns can dry up, moving a highway can dry up an entire town. And comparing and contrasting that as well to the amount of time spent in the woods and the amount of time, seeing life and death firsthand, I got fairly obsessed with vulture culture. It's a lot of people who, it's what Laurel does as a taxidermist, who articulate bone and who find bone out in the woods and process it in such a way that it can be turned into art and jewelry and beauty. I was really obsessed with that as a way to deal with mortality. And it happened to coincide perfectly with a local legend. It's a story that's fairly common in as far as ghost stories in Appalachia go, Rawhead and Bloody Bones. And the briefest version that I can give you of that basically is when a witch's familiar, a giant hog, is slain by the poacher down the holler, she summons up a spirit of revenge from his bone pile that stands up on two legs and goes running through the woods. And but at the end of the day, it's still her friend, and it comes and it sits in the rocking chair and talks to you. So while I was processing all of this grief, I was thinking, this thing feels like a monster to me, but like, how do you turn a monster into something that sits up in your rocking chair? And, how do you get control over this? So tying in a lot of those elements together, I ended up with this novel right here.
Yeah, and we're gonna, everything you said, I have so many questions about, we're gonna get into so much, but I'd love for you to introduce us to Laurel, our main character, and read a little bit from the beginning for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got my finished copies came
Your
today.
finished copy. Yay!
I'm holding this thing that doesn't feel real in my hands. Let me read to you from chapter 1. A symphony of survival wound its way through the emerald tobacco fields of the early farm. The dead things sang their harmony in the mid-July heat, loud enough to drown out the cicadas' screams. By the roots of a sycamore tree, half a jawbone waited in the dirt for Laurel Early to find it. It was a good jaw. It had held on to most of its teeth even after the gums peeled away and beetles stripped it of its flesh. She rinsed it in the shallows of the river running alongside the fields and tucked it into her bag as she continued her walk, looking for more bones to add to her collection. The jawbone had belonged to a fox, but when he laid his head down and failed to lift it again, he left his jaw and every other part of him up for grabs. What was left belonged to Laurel. That was the rule with bones. Unless you hid them in a casket below the earth, anyone could eat, break, or use them to their advantage. Laurel was one such scavenger. She made half her living off growing tobacco, and the other half off what the dead left behind. She needed the cash flow now more than ever. Her student loans would soon dry up into debt without the degree she'd set out for last fall. So she boiled flesh and fat from bones, or let them dry in the sun, then strung them onto bracelets or twisted them up in wire to make hairpins and brooches. These sold in her online store for far less than their lives were worth. Laurel used the slabs of limestone jutting out from the soil as steps towards the secluded cemetery at the top of the hill, where she stopped each morning to catch her breath before heading back. It was a hard spot to see until you were right up on it. The view from the main road was obscured by honey locusts. From there, you could look down and see the whole of Laurel's world. The tobacco barn high upon the hill, the equipment barn in the bottom, surrounded by its own graveyard of skeletal old car frames, and the farm equipment covered by ragged blue tarps. Above it was the small white farmhouse where she lived with her uncle. She kept a cheerful-looking rabbit hutch painted a faded red in the yard behind a slanting little wash house. A wire fence restrained a garden heaving with vegetables, and below, 6 acres of tobacco fields sprawled. Beyond that, the thin arms of the shallow river cradled the property. The cemetery's border stuck out of the ground like jagged teeth grinning atop the hill. It was an eyesore, all chicken wire and thick wooden fence posts, a rust-speckled bull gate instead of wrought iron entryway. Laurel loved the practicality of it, uniform with the rest of the fences and gates of the early property. It was farm functional, no different from the fields where the tobacco grew. It wasn't violating a sacred space when she hopped the bull gate. It was just stopping by for a visit. Buried in a concrete vault and a metal casket 6 feet below the ground was another set of bones. These belonged to Laurel's mother and had been there for the better part of 20 years. Other bones had rested there longer. Laurel Early's grandparents, her great-grandparents, great-great-aunts, and uncles she'd never met, and a baby, about 100 years older than Laurel, marked with a date but not a name. Her mother's gravestone was her favorite of the grim assortment. Laurel loved the way the rain-stained marble looked sticking out of the earth, engraved simply, Anna Early. Laurel had traced those letters with her fingertips since long before she could read them. "Did you miss me?" she asked, half whispering. "Well, you won't have to anymore. I'm staying home for good. College didn't work out." The wonderful thing about having a tombstone for a mother was that she couldn't disapprove. Can we keep going?
That's good. Yeah. A little intro. We don't want to give any secrets away, and there are many secrets in this book. And so I'd love to start by talking about a sense of place, which you mentioned in the beginning, and it was very, very evident reading this book that it was written by someone who had lived their life in this area. Like it wasn't that it was specific, but you could tell that it like came from inside a person. Really, like it was a place that had made up their entire being. And so I'd love to hear just a little bit about your relationship to place and Kentucky specifically in Appalachia, because everything was just so specific, but you could tell, like I said, that it was from someone who had spent so much time there, and their sense of self was defined by it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it is a love letter to Kentucky for all of its, rotting and climbing out of the ground and pulling itself back up. I think that there's a lot of Kentucky that feels like that, particularly just the history of the region and the personal sort of connection to it too. I knew when I wrote this book I really wanted to write something with a deep connection to place and to land. I went through a walk through my family's farm in late June and listed all of the flowers and made notes of sort of how they connected with one another and which ones were blooming as the other ones were fading and sort of stuff like that, just because I wanted to capture something that I've loved for years and years and years. And then, of course, because I'm me, I had to twist it a little bit further than it would go, naturally, and explore a lot of the complicated feelings that live inside you when, you know, you're deciding whether to leave or to stay. And I think I had this conversation with a Kentuckian earlier today, actually, about why this is a YA novel, is because almost everybody I know who lives in Kentucky at around the time that they're Laurel's age, maybe a little younger, a little older, has to grapple with the question of whether to stay or to leave. And I was grappling with that to a certain extent while I was writing the book myself. So I just wanted to hold as much of it as possible in my hands and explore, you know, what's good, what's bad, what's there, and what it feels like when it's not quite what you remember from childhood and it's not quite what you wanted it to be when you were an adult. How you reckon with that, particularly as somebody who is queer, growing up here. You know, there's a lot of questions that you ask that maybe your neighbors aren't asking, about your identity and your ability to stay. And so I didn't end up really wanting to answer that for anybody but myself. And that's why a lot of the characters, you know, Laurel's friends, they're all given reasons to go and reasons to stay, that all impact each other pretty strongly. And one of the reasons to stay that is in common with all of them is love for each other and love for the land. But also, one of the reasons to go that's universal for them all is the understanding that land does not necessarily love you back in the way that you would ever understand love to look like. Land is going to do as it does. And that was a both scary thing to write. I think that's where a lot of the horror elements come in, the understanding that, you know, when you're out in the woods, there's always something watching you, and there's always some way that you can mess up that would, you know, cause a lot of trouble and pain. So exploring that, but also exploring, you know, what a comfort that is at the same time. The idea that anything can change, you know, human beings, we can do different things, we can need different things from the land, we can move and go, but what the land is doing will stay consistent long after human beings have even stopped existing. And so that was a pretty important thing that features fairly importantly in the magical system. You know, it's the magical system of Wake the Bones is not necessarily like, here's this thing that I can harness and use and control that makes sense to me. You know, it's here's this wondrous and beautiful thing that I get to be a part of, and I get to exercise my will, and I get to see, you know, what happens if I do this and that. But at the end of the day, I don't necessarily control the outcome with just a flick of my hand.
That's something that I noticed and I loved so much about this story is I wouldn't really call it a fantasy or even like magic exists within, like you said, there's a magical system that is at play in this story and this place that we're in. But whether it's the land or the groundedness in this place, it doesn't feel as it doesn't feel fantastical. It still feels so grounded in reality. And at the same time, the devil that they're dealing with doesn't, like, he is still manifested within this magical system, but he also so seamlessly is like the issues that they're dealing with. So you really balanced that idea of, you know, your demons being metaphorical and your demons being a walking pile of bones on 2 feet. Yeah. Like it was something that I really enjoyed, because a lot of times, like, you can read a fantasy YA novel especially, and you know that you're in fantasy, you're taken away out of like a real life situation, and there are stakes, but it is ultimately fantastical. But the way that this was written was just so fun to read in that way. Because one, I have a note that I want to talk about the devil. I'm like, let's talk about the devil. Because he is so charismatic and charming in this manifestation a little bit. And we don't see him very much. We don't interact with him very much. But when we do, he is a way out, which he's offering a way out, which is what you mentioned. All of these characters are sort of looking for. If they have a way out, how are they going to get out? if they don't want to get out, how do they keep from being either swept out or pulled out? And I'm sure, as you mentioned earlier, there are so many stories and tales about the devil in this region. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about how this devil, like how he came about and what
Yeah.
his like personality, how it sort of unfolded.
Well, I owe a lot to, I mean, both with Rawhead and Bloody Bones and a lot of the magical existing system in the region, there is a wealth of magic, there is a wealth of mystery, and there is a wealth of horror to the region. I mean, like, I grew up parented in part by ghost stories, I joke. The idea of a woman at the bottom of the well was a very practical and easy way to keep us from playing on top of the well.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, no, the idea of a devil in the woods, there's always this fear, I feel like, when you're walking through the woods that you're going to run into something unknown. Like, for me, my real life fear is, there's been a lot of resurgence of this like myth of something like whistling in the woods that'll come and get you and eat you in Appalachia, and that's like not something that we're particularly concerned about. It's like, oh, don't go into the woods at night in Appalachia. It's like, tell that to people who work third shift, like or teenagers who are out shooting stop signs. Like it's people are out all night in Appalachia. It's fine. But what does scare me more than anything, my own personal fear, is that I'm going to be walking through the woods and like somebody has let a tiger loose, like some sort of crappy zoo. And so I tried to harness that real life fear and connect it with this sort of myth of the outsider, the other, the coal baron, if you're a little further east, the person who wants to take advantage, who wants to use what you've got, who doesn't really value you as a person necessarily, but surely can offer you something that, feels very worthwhile at the time, but then all of a sudden you've signed away, mineral rights, and then they take the land up from under you. There's a lot of things that aren't remotely paranormal that feature in that sort of story, but I needed a malevolent spirit and a malevolent force, and so it's less like, he's not like capital S Satan, he's more of a devil of myth. Yeah. And so tapping into that sort of those original myths where, you have this sly talking spirit that comes down to you off the hill and all of a sudden, something is happening that shouldn't be happening. But the thing I liked about writing his... And he's a fairly abstract villain because he gets to represent a lot of things. He gets to play with a lot. Is compiling a lot of things about the culture and the outside culture, sort of the war between. If that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So... yeah, I liked a lot of fairly abstract, gross concepts of pollution and gore, but then also, the pulling in aspect as well, the seductive aspect. It was a lot of fun to write. And I let myself have a lot of fun writing bad with that one. If you can name a character the devil, that there's not, you're not playing with an ethical code here. You don't have to be like, this villain is morally gray. You're like, oh, this guy sucks. Like, let's make it work. And I liked having him play in relation to the land as well. I think it was important to me to write the land as a character with its own desires and needs that are separate from the people walking on top of it. So I liked making him part of this sort of struggle earlier than time where, you have life and death, and that's the cycle as it should be. And then you have what people have been doing since the beginning of time, what Laurel is doing to an extent, both with her mother and with taxidermy, which is trying to preserve it and hold on to it and treat it unnaturally as possible. So he does a lot of heavy lifting for me, but I think he was a fun character to write. I loved writing him. I loved writing Anna. I loved Isaac's point of view, and I was able to do it as well. Like, I just sort of let myself do a lot.
I was gonna say another character that I feel like would have been extremely fun to write was Christine.
Oh my god. I keep saying I'm never gonna never say never, but I feel like I'm pretty done with all of the characters in this world, except for sometimes Christine comes into my head in the middle of the night and bites me on the back of like the neck and is like, hey, maybe there's something more here. So I loved her voice. I needed her from the beginning. I have so much adoration and awe and hero worship for these mean ass country women who have seen it all, have done it all, who know you're dumb, who know you're going to
Yeah.
figure it out. There, Christine is a love letter to like 25 women who have had incredibly difficult conversations with me while smoking a cigarette. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know if it's obvious, but
She's definitely a love letter, and it's like it's a love letter to anyone who's taught you anything. You
yeah.
know, who's ever taken the time, cigarette or not, to sit down and like explain something to you, whether they do it kindly or matter of factly.
Well, and it was, yeah, working at, like, my first job was as a waitress, and it sucked.
Yeah.
And but those women who just know how to do it and know how to do everything else in life, basically, and will take you by the neck as a 16-year-old and be like, hey, watch it. That's Christine, and I love her so much.
And I'd love to talk a little bit about our sort of main four characters. So we've got Laurel and her best friend Isaac, um, and then Ricky and Garrett, who are brothers who are at home in Kentucky still when Laurel comes back. They've all grown up together, and they are all in their own ways, as we mentioned, kind of grappling with that decision of whether to stay or whether to go. And what I loved so much about each of their sort of storylines that we follow as they grapple with that question is, it almost seems like none of them feel as though it is that simple. Like it isn't I'm gonna leave or I'm gonna stay. And they, even though some of them choose the same option, the choice feels so different for everyone. And that choice, like you said, for so many people in that area, it is like they're making it for the same reasons or whatever. I can't stay any longer, or I have to leave now, or I will never leave, or all of those things. And there were just such interesting conversations about that question between the four of them, specifically with Isaac and Garrett. It was so heartbreaking in some ways, because I wanted them all to do what they felt they needed to do, but at the same time it was so heartbreaking to know that that may not end up being the same thing. But also that feeling that place holds so much weight, in, like you said, the land and the place and where you are at makes such a difference in how you make that decision. And the fact that they have Cincinnati, which is a little ways away, but so close that you can go there and not have Kentucky. They've tasted a little something else that works. It was just such a, I love a YA novel that has like very in-depth, nuanced, like internal ideas for kids, especially when they're like, when they have to think about those big decisions, which not a lot of, some kids don't have to, some
Right.
kids don't have to make those choices. And this was an example of some
They don't
that
get
it
to
feels,
as well.
yeah,
There's a
and
lot
it
of
feels
people
like
who,
life or death to them.
yeah. I mean, that one, that was the easy part of it for me to write. That's a decision that every single person in my life has made at one point or another,
Yeah.
basically, is, there's, if you're choosing to stay in Kentucky, which I think, I mean, I'm in Kentucky right now, like, this is a choice, you're staying for a reason, and you're staying for a fight a lot of the time, and deciding whether or not, it's not a right or wrong decision, like, and I don't want anybody to think that, like, and I mean, they make different decisions. I don't want to spoil the book, but it's, I've got a lot of friends in a lot of different area codes, and we all started out in the same spot, and I'm really proud of that. I am so proud of the decisions that the people who I love have made. And they've made them for a lot of reasons, and they're not necessarily the reasons that I think people expect about Kentucky either. Like, for example, like, I, as a queer person living in the South, there is always I mean the shock that I get in New York City, like, oh my God, you live in Kentucky. Like, are you the only gay person you know? Like, I not even close. Like, I wanted to like make it clear that even in the rural South, there are little pockets of acceptance for some people. Like Garrett could probably live very comfortably, and he discusses that, like he's willing to do what he needs to do to stay home and enjoy, without a lot of trouble. But he and Isaac are exactly the same in the aspect of their sexuality and their orientation and how they've learned to deal with it growing up. But the difference is really supportive parents, and that's the difference for a lot of queer kids in the South. That's where the choice gets made for you a lot of times, is the love and support of your parents and your family. So that was one aspect that I really wanted to explore. And then the idea necessarily, Laurel is really set on a vision of her home that she has seen 100 times, because trying to do the weird thing out in the world did not work for her. But the same cannot be said of Ricky, who does want to stay, but who doesn't necessarily want to get married at 18 and, do the sort of thing that he's seen everybody he went to high school with do. He wants to stay there, but he wants to see what staying there could possibly look like. And a lot of their courtship, it's a very classic sort of courtship for the area, teasing and fighting and, that sort of thing, that sort of young, ridiculous love. But at the same time, the destination and the goal is fairly different for each of them. So, and they have to figure out how to exist,
Yeah.
as a couple.
And you talked about, kind of walking through your family's land and looking at the flowers and what was there and what was fading and what was coming back. And I feel like this is constantly happening, even with the things that or you think so well, that you've known so long, so well. Did you feel like you learned anything or discovered anything either about yourself or your land or your family or anything while you were working on this and writing this book?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have always been given the advice that when you write a book, you should know the answer to the question that you're asking before you start, and I did not with this book. I was like, hey, how do I live with this life, basically?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I'm asking it again. This was an answer that worked a couple of years ago, and I now have another question, so we'll see what the next book holds. But yeah, no, I was trying to figure out the answer to a lot of different things. And I mean, you do that when you're in the woods anyways. I just brought a plot to it. But it was, in terms of practical skills, I have learned bone articulation and taxidermy. I actually got to do a European mount. My dad took a deer a couple years ago, and I was like, all right, let's get, there was a pressure washer involved. I'll spare you a lot of details, but it was it was messy work. But I wanted to understand, I've always sort of seen death, like, when you're in the country, you see things die all the time. But I wanted to sort of understand this sort of level that people take it to, and explore it without, judgment or disgust or whatever. And I found out, I mean, just the anatomical knowledge that I gained was fascinating.
Yeah.
But I also found out just a lot about time and a lot about how things, I don't necessarily know how to articulate what I found from that, but it was a fascinating thing to learn. And then, practically I brushed up on a lot of botany. I'm still terrible at tree identification, but I can walk around and tell you the name of probably 100 different kinds of flowers, and plants, etc. And I can tell you what pollinators like them and stuff like that, and what's invasive and what's not. We have just an incredible prairie system that used to be there before people decided to farm. You can't criticize people for eating, but farming has its problems, especially running a lot of cattle and impacting land a lot. There's a lack of diversity that comes back up. So knowing, when you see something rare, when you see something beautiful in the woods, when you see a flower that isn't very common, appreciating that all the more, and also knowing that the best way to see more of it the next year is to step back, put your hands up, and walk away from it, not take a picture of it, not tell anybody where you found it, just leave it alone. I think that was a big lesson as well.
Yeah. And then one of my big questions that I love to ask people when we talk about books is if there is a medium or a any sort of like art form or creative form that you haven't tried yet, that you either really want to or you're not sure, like you have a fear of trying it or you haven't had the chance yet, whichever, but something that you'd really love to try.
Well, I was really blessed in that I went to a performing arts high school, so I got to do a lot of experimenting with a lot of different art forms. And there are some art forms that I keep myself kind of purposefully bad at, that I don't try to monetize or use in any sort of way, shape, or form. I love music. I always have really loved music. I was big into like the punk and hardcore scene growing up. And that's great because you don't have to be particularly good.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd like to, you know what, a specific answer. I have never officially tried to play the drums. It is something that I've been thinking a lot about recently. I've got more of an understanding of how people do that than I used to. But it's like an investment.
Oh yeah.
Like that's why there's not a lot of drummers in a lot of like bands around the time. It's just because you have to be certain. You can't just pick up like a $100 Fender terrible amp like I did when I was 11 and then be like a half decent bassist. Like you've got to invest time and a lot of noise. So yeah, I want to play the drums.
Amazing. I can't wait for the Wake the Bones soundtrack of just Elizabeth's drum solos.
That'd be a horror novel right there.
Yes. And then before we wrap up, I would love to know what you've been reading or any books or journals or anything that you would recommend to people that you've been enjoying.
Ooh, that is such a good question. I am Leslie Vedder's The Bone Spindle. I'm like 25 pages into it right now. I just love... There have been so many good books that have come out this year. And I haven't had as much time to read this year with my own book coming out as I wanted to. But that's one that has been, like, I just keep sneaking away to it. I've had, it's been a pretty busy day, but I've been, like, a page at a time, just, like, really hoping to sink my teeth into it at some point soon. It's fantastic. That's one I'd recommend. Just in general, I'm trying to think. I mean, like, if you're interested in writing fantasy, my, like, go-to and the thing that I always, like, return to as a basis for, like, how to structure stories, because it is incredibly structured in terms of, like, what it does, but it always surprises you. Howl's Moving Castle, Diana Wynne Jones, anything Diana Wynne Jones, quite frankly, but Howl's Moving Castle was my first, like... book that gave me like fluttering. I was so excited about it, and I've read it so many times, and I understand, how she structures her chapters and stuff like that as a result, that when I'm like lost or stuck or just really absolutely burnt out, it's a very different book than Wake the Bones, obviously, but it is my fantasy primer.
Well, you have given everyone some great recommendations, and also pretty soon, when this episode comes out, Wake the Bones will be on our shelves at SKYLIT Books, and they will be the beautiful finished copies that Elizabeth is holding in her hand now. So exciting.
Believe this is real. Like I set that box out on my porch for like 5 minutes before I could go out and get it. I was like, I heard the weight of the UPS van dropping it, and I was like, okay, that's real. I know what that is.
Those are books.
Yeah.
And pretty soon, all of our listeners will be able to grab a copy on our website at skylitbooks.com or in store. And until then, happy listening, and we hope to see you all soon. My guest again today was Elizabeth Kilcoyne, and her debut novel, YA novel, Wake the Bones, is out now. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the SKYLIT Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylitbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.